In this video, I'll be reviewing Freud's perspective on personality development, and I'll review things like levels of consciousness, the stages of psychosexual development, defense mechanisms, and the id, ego, and superego. All right, so I'd like for you to take a moment to reflect on these statements and whether you think they're true or false for you. So let's start with the first one. I believe my parents have been one of the most influential forces in my development. Next, events that occurred in childhood still affect me today. Next, I sometimes experience a struggle from within myself. And then sometimes I'm not aware of my own motivations and desires. And then finally, sometimes when I'm in an argument, I feel they assume, or the other person assumes, that I'm upset when I'm actually fine. My next question is, to what extent do you think our behavior is influenced by desires and urges of which we're unaware? What I'm talking about here is the unconscious. So the behavioral perspective is very different from what we call the psychodynamic perspective. The psychodynamic or psychoanalytic perspective suggests that our behavior is largely directed by things we are not aware of. It influences, or it's influenced by those things that were on that last slide, like your early childhood experiences, the internal struggles that you have that you might not even be aware of. How many of you feel that that is important in affecting who you are today? Well, let's take a look at this concept or this perspective in more depth. So first, when we think about the unconscious, probably for most of you, you think about Sigmund Freud. And as many of you will recall from what you've read, maybe in other classes, and what you've started to read in your textbook, is that he focused on the unconscious. And Freud came about during a time that's called the Victorian era. And this was in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and this was in Vienna, Austria. Freud's professional background goes back to some influences from a very well-known neurologist named Charcot. And Freud learned under this neurologist the possibilities to induce or eliminate what were called hysterical neurotic symptoms. And this was through hypnotic suggestions. So he did reject hypnosis as a therapeutic technique. So he wasn't using that himself, but he was almost smitten by Charcot's lectures and his demonstrations. And so he became, through his experiences with Charcot, very affected by this. And he transformed from a neurologist, because that's what Freud initially was, to a psychopathologist or a psychologist. So during this Victorian era in the late 1800s and early 1900s, he became really the person who formed the bedrock for psychoanalysis. Probably many of you have heard of psychoanalysis. You may have learned about it in another course, but I still would like to review this a little bit. So psychoanalysis is a type of therapy with the goal of releasing pent-up or repressed emotions and memories in order to lead a client to what was called, or could be called, catharsis or healing. So the goal of psychoanalysis is to bring what exists at the unconscious up to consciousness. And it's done by talking to another person about the big questions in life, the things that matter, and really diving into the complexities that lie beneath the simple surface. And this is a process that did not happen overnight. This would take years, and he would have clients who would come to see him. They were mostly very wealthy women, and these were women who he said had what he called hysteria. They were neurotic, and they would spend several times a week with him, and he was trying to illuminate what was in their unconscious that was driving some of those neurotic tendencies and behaviors and ways of thinking. So his focus was on unconscious forces. and on childhood experiences. Although I have to say, Freud's primary focus was on unconscious sexual and aggressive impulses. Today's psychoanalysts focus not so much on that, but on childhood experiences that play a significant role in determining who you are. So when you go back to those statements where I asked you to respond true or false, ask yourself, what role do you think your early childhood experiences have played in shaping who you are? Do you remember all of those experiences? Are they in your unconscious? Do you think that our unconscious influences who we are? Freud believed that there are three structures of our personality. These include our id, ego, and superego. So the id is very primitive and it operates based upon the pleasure principle. And so the idea behind the id is that you have needs and you want those needs to be met. When you were born, when you were a baby, you were very id. Your personality was dominated by that. It's give me what I want it now. I don't need to figure out what's going on in reality. I don't have to think about moral standards. I don't even understand what that means at that point in time in my development. So I'm very driven by my id. So I just want to fulfill my very basic needs, the things that I want. And then we have what's called the ego. And this is the decision-making component, and it operates according to the reality principle. And so it's coordinating the demands of the id with the demands of the superego. So it's the moral component of our personality. It goes along with what we think society is saying we need to be doing. So we could think of it as our conscience. It's our moral values and our principles that are within that environment that we've grown up in. So we learn what we need to be doing, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And so the ego is balancing between those the id's primitive needs and the superego's moral principles and values. And so in very early childhood, when we're infants, we are dominated by our id. As we grow and develop, we begin to develop our superego. And at around the age of 5, the superego, it's in the process of developing in the child's behavior. And it's doing so by identification with the parents. So the child begins to take on the moral norms and ideals. Um, they, they sort of They observe their parents. They take on the traits of their parent, boys taking on the trait of their dad, girls of their mom, according to Freud, which now, as I say that, you're probably beginning to think about some of the possible criticisms of this particular theory. So I want you to remember, though, as you learn about these theories, let's go back and think about the imbalance of bodily humors or the body shapes. Those sound ridiculous for many of you, but think about how that view shaped then people's thinking as they thought about other things that might be contributing to personality, other biological variables. And so that they were on the right track. When as people came up with those ideas that our biology is influencing our behavior, they were on the right track and they were operating based upon the information that they had at the time and what was going on in society, the culture. And so with Freud, I think you'll hear people who are very quick to discredit him or discount him. But I want you to, as we look at other perspectives and as you learn more in this course, and just as you think about other things you've learned in psychology, think about how much Freud has influenced later fields and other perspectives. And, when we think about hindsight, when we look back in history at any particular field, we can always find something to criticize. But it's important for us to put things in perspective, to understand the cultural and historical context. I do want to point out that in Vienna, Austria, at the time when Freud came about during the Victorian era, people were expected to be very controlled of their behaviors, especially women. They were supposed to dress very simply, not wear cosmetics. There was, women were supposed to not show any sexuality. They were supposed to be very controlled. So if you're growing up in that environment as a woman and you get angry or you have natural biological feelings, and your society is telling you you have to be controlled. You have to follow whatever our society is saying you need to do, which was pretty repressive for women at the time. You could see then how Freud would begin to think that there must be something that is pushing women to have these anxieties and neuroses like he was seeing. And so he was explaining that through the lens of what was happening at the time. So I think, again, it's important for us to always think about theorists within the historical context and also within the culture and within the confines of the information and science that was available. Based on this perspective, much of our mind is comprised of the unconscious. We can think of it as an iceberg that's beneath the surface. If we look at an iceberg, if we were to look at a large iceberg, we would only be seeing the tip of the iceberg, right? We're not going to see that much of it. But if we went beneath the surface of the water, we would see how deep that iceberg actually is. And that's the unconscious. It is very deep and it's well below the surface of awareness, and it greatly influences our behavior. Those things that are just beneath the surface that we can easily access, like what did you eat for dinner last night? Where did you go on vacation when you were 16 with your parents? Or anything that you can pretty easily remember, that's part of your preconscious. And what you're currently thinking right now, that is your conscious awareness. So here's the iceberg, and you can see its alignment with the id, superego, and the ego. So the id is unconscious, the superego is partially unconscious, and then we can see the ego is not in the unconscious. It's in our preconscious and in our conscious. And our unconscious uses strategies to protect us from anxious thoughts and feelings. And these are called defense mechanisms. They're not inherently bad. They can allow us to navigate painful experiences or to use our energy in more productive ways. But when we are using them too often or for too long, this, of course, can be problematic. Let's take a look at these defense mechanisms. So I have here a diagram that shows you an example of each of these defense mechanisms. So you might want to pause this. You could jot it down in your notes to help you to remember some of these defense mechanisms. I'd encourage you to think about some other examples. Think about some that you think you may have seen in other people. And think about why people are using these defense mechanisms as you reflect on that. Remember, it's really to deal with or to control those potential feelings of anxiety. So we first have repression. This is where we block difficult thoughts from entering into our consciousness. And this might be a trauma survivor who is shutting out a tragic experience. And then we have projection. And projection is where a person is taking their own unacceptable feelings and they are then projecting them or attributing them to another person. So for example, let's say that a bully is constantly ridiculing a peer about their insecurities. We might say that the bully is projecting his own struggle with self-esteem onto that other person. And I know I'm giving you examples other than what's up here, but I just want you to have several different examples so that you can see how many, you can be thinking about the different ways that these may be expressed or that we might see them in the real world. Another is displacement, and this is where we redirect an emotional reaction from who is the rightful recipient, I guess we could say, to another person. So let's say that a manager is screaming at an employee and the employee doesn't scream back, but later that night, when that employee gets home, maybe they have an argument or they're very, unkind to their partner or to their friend. And then we have reaction formation. And this is when we express the opposite of our true feelings. So let's say that you have a man, for example, who feels insecure about his masculinity. And maybe what he does is he acts overly aggressive. So we're seeing an opposite response, an opposite behavior that's an exaggerated opposite of how he actually feels. And regression is where we revert to the behavior or emotions of an earlier developmental stage. So maybe, for example, you're upset and you're not getting what you want, and so you throw what might look like a child's temper tantrum. And then we have rationalization, and this is probably one you're very familiar with. I feel like I don't know about you all, but I've noticed that often what happens is that people may, if people are using these, you might see them kind of depending on one more than they would another one. And so you might see someone using one of these frequently. I think rationalization is a pretty common one that we see, and it's not totally infrequent for people to use this. And this is where we justify a mistake by with seemingly logical reasons or explanations. I think you see this happening. For example, let's say you have a partner or a friend, they say something that's really unkind to you, and rather than just saying, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that, they may blame you. Well, if you hadn't said that, then I wouldn't have done this. And so this is really helping to reduce those bad feelings of anxiety they would otherwise have. And then we have identification. And identification is where the person is forming an imaginary or real alliance with someone else or a group. And so they may, for example, they become very preoccupied with a sports team or with some, maybe it's with, as your example here is stating, with a fraternity. So they're identifying with that group, and then that helps them to increase their self-esteem. So there are more defense mechanisms than these. These are just some. And what I'd like for you to do is I'm going to turn this slide and I'm going to show you some examples. And I want you to see if you can figure out which ones each of these are. So I'd like for you to pause your slideshow. I'd like for you to pause this and see if you can figure out which defense mechanism seems to be being used. I have this all centering around ice cream, but I just wanted to do this because people all have different ways of dealing with the same potential anxiety. So go ahead and pause this and see if you can figure out the answers. And once you've done that, then you could press play and I'm going to share the answers. All right, so let's look at these. So we have rationalization. The person says, oh, it's a special occasion. The calories don't count. There's peanuts and peanuts are healthy. You hear this like dark chocolate's really good for you. And then repression. A person, is forgetting to include the ice cream. They don't want to acknowledge that. And then for the next one, we have projection. And this is where the person is not focusing on themselves. They're focusing on another person. So they're trying to get rid of those uncomfortable feelings by attributing them to someone else. And then here we have a person who denies eating the whole ice cream, and this person, of course, is on a diet. And, they're really denying reality. They don't want to acknowledge it. So that's denial. And then we have a person who feels bad about this. And so they then start to watch childhood cartoons. And then finally, we have the person who begins to admire their thinner friend and are copying some of their eating and exercise habits. And this is identification. So make sure you know each of these. And I'd encourage you to think about where you see these. I think you see these in television programs, you see them in film, and you definitely see them among people that you know. Freud said that we go through a series of stages of what he called psychosexual development, and they're summarized in your textbook. And so what he shared was that, or what he came up with, is that we have stages that begin at birth, and that it's really by the time we're about 5 years old, approximately, that our personality is pretty well formed. I recognize for many of you, you may have heard of these stages, but I still want to spend a moment to go back over them just to highlight some of the key points. So we have the first stage, which is the oral stage. And the focus here is on the mouth. And there's a conflict, just like in every stage, according to Freud. The primary conflict here is weaning. In other words, no longer breastfeeding. It's important to note that this theory is something that is affected by culture. So in our culture, especially with breastfeeding, for example, we see that there are many women who don't breastfeed, and we also see that it's pretty typical that by the end of the first year of a baby's life, that's when breastfeeding stops. There are women who breastfeed longer and much longer than that. So I'm just going off of what the average is. And so, within what the culture says is pretty typical, That's what we're talking about when we talk about when weaning would start to affect the child. So let's say that the mother's weaning way too soon, and maybe the mother's weaning at 3 months of age. According to Freud, this could cause the child to become orally fixated, or maybe the mother's breastfeeding way past the time that within that culture is typical. Then that could also affect the child's development in this stage. And Freud said that if we go through a stage and we're not successful, we can develop a fixation. And then the fixation becomes characterized by traits that are associated with that stage. So we might do things like put our fingers in our mouth, or like bite our fingernails, or chew on pens, need to chew gum all of the time, overeat, anything involving the mouth. And we could see personality traits that can come about here. So a child who is breastfed for too long may become dependent and passive, and one who is breastfed not long enough could become cruel, sarcastic, and have biting remarks. So again, when we look at this, some of you may say, I don't know about this. I wasn't breastfed, and I don't feel like I'm oral aggressive, or my mom breastfed me for quite a while, and I don't feel like I'm gullible and dependent. There's not a lot of research that supports this, this particular part of Freud's approach. I will tell you there is research supporting the existence of the unconscious and that it does affect us. And we do see defense mechanisms in use. But this is, again, just like those earlier theories or approaches to thinking about personality, like the bodily humors or body shape. This is a stage approach. And this stage approach that Freud came up with had a significant effect on future theorists who then also came up with stage approaches. Like, for example, Erik Erikson, that you may have learned about in another class. And if you didn't, that's okay. We'll be looking at Erikson this semester. And so Erikson's a very well-known theorist, lots of research supporting his perspective. And he's a stage theorist, just like Freud. And there are other stage theorists that are very well known. One, for example, is Piaget. Now, his is not related to our personality, it's related to cognition, but still a stage theorist. In this video, we've reviewed some of the basics that are related to Freud's perspective on personality development. We've reviewed the psychosexual stages of development, the 3 levels of consciousness, the id, the ego, and superego, and defense mechanisms. In future videos, we'll be reviewing the role of biology in personality development and traits, and we'll also be taking a look at personality testing.